Next, we sit down with State Senator Daniel Biss, who talks about the details of the proposed Secure Choice Retirement Savings Program, which would create an automatic enrollment IRA for the nearly 2.5 million Illinois employees without an employee-sponsored retirement plan. This runs about 45 minutes.
Senator Dan Biss, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me.
You know, one of the areas that people get to be my age, they often go, gee, I'm going to have to retire in 10 years, and then all of a sudden they kind of hadn't focused on it and they don't have the money that they need. And one of the other big issues that the state is facing is the pension issue. And so you have a program, the Secure Choice Retirement Plan, that you're proposing, and I wanted to delve into some of those issues, what it would do, and why you think it's necessary. So let's lay out just some of those. What actually is your bill and how would it operate?
Great. Well, thanks for the question. And as you said, there are a lot of different issues around the concept of retirement that we talk about, whether they be Social Security and its long-term projected underfunding challenges, whether it be public pension debt, whether it be the 401k system and its challenges. Those are actually not what the Secure Choice program is about. The Secure Choice program is about a population of people, about 2.5 million people in Illinois, that's roughly half of the private sector workforce, who have no access to any employer-sponsored retirement plan. So that means that they have Social Security, and then beyond that, they'll be relying on whatever savings they can accumulate without the benefit of a payroll deduction. The reason that's significant is that research shows overwhelmingly that people who have access through their work to save money using a payroll deduction out of each paycheck are at least somewhat likely to take advantage of it. Those who don't are overwhelmingly unlikely to. And so the population we're talking about are, for the most part, going to be relying entirely or almost entirely on Social Security for their retirement, which is just not what Social Security was intended for. So what does the bill do? What the bill does is it sets up an automatic enrollment IRA. If you're in this category, which is to say if your employer offers nothing for retirement besides Social Security, and if they have at least 25 employees to make sure that the administrative capacity is there, then you'll be automatically enrolled, putting away 3% of each paycheck into this IRA. You can opt out if you don't want to do it. You can put in more or less than 3% if you want. But if you don't make any affirmative decision, you'll be putting 3% away, and then that money will be pooled together over all the likely more than 1 million participants across the state, so that the state will be able to bid with a private investment manager to bring down the fees and allow people in this program to have something waiting for them in retirement to supplement Social Security.
So I'm going to restate some of that just to kind of drive it home again. One of the failures is that why people, as you said, and you're right, the vast majority of people never set money aside for retirement. They certainly don't do it when they should,
Right.
when they're young. As I sometimes say to people, if you want to have a bountiful harvest, when should you plant your corn seeds? In April or in August?
Right.
And it's the same thing. You need those years to grow your money. So it seems to me that while there's some complexity to it, one of the simple components of your plan is that it's an automatically starts and you have to affirmatively opt out of it instead of having to opt into something.
Yeah, that is really almost the whole ball of wax. That is really the innovation that makes this work. I will tell you that has started to happen already in the 401k space in the private sector. So in 2006, Congress passed legislation to clarify that employers who offer a 401k may do just the same thing of having people automatically in unless they affirmatively opt out. And since that time, employers have gone in that direction. 58% of large employers that offer 401ks now do it as an automatic enrollment where you're in by default unless you affirmatively opt out. And the reason is they find that people like it. There are some people who get automatically enrolled who don't like it and get upset, that's true, but there are many more people who say, if I had not been put in automatically, I wouldn't have done anything about it. Here I am 10 years later, having planted my seed corn at the appropriate time of year, having watched that grow, having benefited from compound interest at a young age, and I'm extremely grateful for the fact that that was done. So that the idea here is when someone hits the workforce, they have this extremely simple tool. If they say, whoa, I don't want to do it, I want to have my own money at my disposal now, which will be the right decision for some people, they can they can opt out of the program. But for people who aren't really thinking about it, they'll be automatically in. And the basic principle I would say that underlies this is I would challenge you to find somebody in their 60s who will say to you, my one regret about my life so far is that I've put aside too much money for retirement. You just can't find people like that.
Right.
And that's why this automatic enrollment concept is so important.
You know, and to underscore that, I would say, if I were to ask the average person, at the end of their life, what is the main asset that people have? And the answer isn't a matter of opinion, it's factual. It's their home.
Right.
And why is that? Because they may not do this, that, or the other thing. Maybe they'll skip going to the movie theater, but they'll make their mortgage payment. As long as they can make a mortgage payment, one way or another, they'll do it. So it's almost like an automatic savings plan.
That's right.
Except I often tell people, homes make bad piggy banks. Because then you have to go to a banker to take out a home equity loan if you ever just want to pull it out short of selling your home.
Yeah.
But by the same token, this is just something that people should get. If you're automatically putting money in every year, every week, every pay period, just as it builds up in your home, it's going to build up. Only in this instance, it's liquid. In other words, you have access to the money. It's easy to sell 10 shares of stock if you need some money. You can't sell 5% of your home.
Right, that's exactly right. Just as bad a piggy bank as a home is, a retirement account is a perfect piggy bank. It's built to be there when you need it, when you're no longer drawing a salary. The other thing I would say, it's a little bit wonky, but the danger of a home is, a home has two really different functions. Number one, it's the thing you live inside, and number two, it's your, in most people's case, your most valuable asset, your biggest investment. Well, I think about those two concepts pretty differently in my own life, and yet here we are stuck with those two kind of being the same thing. I think the more we can have our kind of financial security strategy put outside of our home so that we're not putting ourselves at huge risk when you have the kind of housing market crash that we had a few years ago, I think the better off people will be.
Yeah, that's something to remind people. People for a long time, at least in the baby boom generation, thought home prices always went up, and in part because of that huge generation buying up homes, building homes. You know, when I'm part of the baby boom generation, when I went to grade school, they had to build more grade schools because, as it's often been said, it's the rat going through the snake. It's just clump.
I would never call you a rat.
Others have. No. But to that end, and look, I will say in this instance, there might be things that and I want to get to some of the other details that might be problematic or some people think are problematic. But the idea that you should save and save early is something that I will say I am biased towards because it is just mathematically obvious. And we should point out, you're a PhD in math, aren't you?
That's right, I used to
Not
teach
that
math.
you have to be, I think. I think this is fourth grade math.
Well,
I mean, you know, money. The point I was going to make is homes don't necessarily go up. They can crash. We had a market crash in homes. It's somewhat coming back. So that when people say, but stock market can crash, yes, but isn't it also mathematically proven that over a long period of time, if you're putting money in, to the extent that you don't need the money right when the crash happens, you're going to benefit by a crash because you're going to be buying more assets for your $100 that's going in every week or whatever it is, and accumulating more assets that then multiply as they come back.
Yeah, you know, you've said a lot of interesting things, so let me respond to a few of them. So first of all, that's right, that the danger, one of the dangers, I should say, in a housing crash is it affects different people really differently depending on what phase they are in their life and career and what the rest of their financial picture looks like. If you happen to be at an age where you bought at the peak of the market and then because of the crash you're laid off and you can't pay your mortgage but you're underwater, that's not the same as having the number in your retirement account go down for a while and then you can ride that out and it can come back up. That's a very different kind of problem and a much more human problem. So that's part of it. But the other thing is, you're right, the math of compound interest and the math that says put that money in early because if you put it in your 20s and 30s, it will have a lot of time to grow before you need to tap it. That's simple math. At the same time, one of the important features of this program is that turns out to be a mistake to ask individuals to have too much of an active role in the management of their retirement, because we're just not built to think that far ahead. And I point the finger at myself first. I got that math PhD. I was pretty sophisticated at thinking about this stuff. In my first job, there was a 401k with a match. And I just didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to focus on it. I wasn't kind of prepared to engage in that kind of planning ahead. Now, fortunately, the HR director kind of twisted my arm and said, don't be an idiot. And so I decided not to be an idiot. But that's a situation where automatic enrollment isn't there because I didn't have the knowledge to work it out for myself. It's because I wanted to think about other things.
And that's an interesting point, because if someone like you, I mean, with all your knowledge, didn't affirmatively take that step, it goes to the point of why you want to have, number one in your plan, that you have to affirmatively jump out of it, not affirmatively jump into it.
That's right. You know, just
It's
one
a big
more anecdote.
psychological hoop, isn't it?
It is. It's a big, that's exactly right. One more anecdote on this. I was talking to an economist who works at a libertarian think tank about this issue. And he completely supports this bill. And he said, you might think a libertarian would have some hesitation, might view this as a little bit too paternalistic. He says, here's how I decided that this was the right thing to do. Our think tank offers a 401k. Everybody who works there has got a master's or a PhD in economics. And I went and asked around, and turned out that only 25% of people were using the 401k that was offered to them.
Wow.
At that point, I realized that automatic enrollment is just necessary. And I think that's the bottom line, that people, whether they ought to know better, like I ought to have known better, or not, people have a lot of trouble thinking far enough ahead to make, in their early 20s, the right decisions for their 70s.
In the course of this interview, the way I want to structure it is I think it's important that people get the benefits of this. And then we'll get to, so we're talking now in this portion about the sweetness. I say that in case people think I'm just doing a, just being rah-rah. I am on one hand, and we'll bring up some of the critical comments, but I want them to understand what's the benefits first.
Right.
And the point I started to make, if someone like you, or the anecdote you just mentioned, the other thing that I think is so good socially about this is how many people were raised in a family, my dad invested, but how many people were raised in a family where they don't? There's no role model that they're exposed to. And so if they never invest, they don't participate in the growth of the American economy or the world economy. I mean, because these days, so I think there's really a very good mechanism here to help those who might be in a lower class economic family, who no one in their world ever has bought a stock or a mutual fund. They may not even be able to explain what that is. Mm-hmm. But if they go to work at McDonald's, and by the way, that's a question, at what point, what age does it kick in? Do you have to be full-time or is it part-time? But if they went to work at a young age at some job and they were putting this in, they'll probably turn around at 30 or 35 and go, oh my gosh, that money I put back in 15 years ago, look, that I never paid attention to, is now $10 or $12 or $15,000.
Well, and I would just point out, first of all, of course, I agree. I would point out there's really a choice of paths here between kind of a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle. Because in the current system, if you're not fortunate enough to be brought up in a household where these kinds of topics are talked about, then you find yourself in your first job unlikely to have the knowledge to affirmatively seek out the kind of financial tools that will enable you to save for retirement, and then you kind of go along over the course of a series of years and decades not saving, and eventually then when you have children, you're also never have been given the benefit of the education that you would like to pass on to them, and then when you reach retirement, you're likely to be dependent upon public assistance because there's no nest egg there waiting to help you through. On the other hand, imagine that same person winds up, as you said, starting at a low-wage job but having initially a few pennies deducted into this account. The account grows. 10, 15 years later, it's got 10, 15, or maybe even $30,000 or $40,000 in it. Number one, the person says, holy cow, that's lucky. I'm glad to see that's there. But number two, the fact that those statements are being mailed home once a month, the fact that that person is then participating in this plan will hopefully be a spur for that person to educate themselves more, maybe do some additional saving for retirement beyond this 3%, and not only participate in the growth of the American economy and the planning for a dignified and secure retirement for themselves, but educate themselves in a way that then their children will grow up in a household where there's a clear discussion of these issues and they'll be better positioned to help themselves in a subsequent generation.
One last thing, and then I'm going to get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts. But have you run the numbers? If you take what is the average or mean, the mean salary, in other words, most people want to use the word average in their mind. So if we use the average salary today, and people had put in, followed your plan, have you run the numbers of how much that money would grow to if you used an historical rate of return?
So we've done a series of different simulations with different assumptions and different examples. The average tends to be that this program is able to replace something like 20 to 25% of your salary when you retire after a full career. So when you put that on top of Social Security, which saves 30 or as much as 40% of your salary, then all of a sudden your retirement income just from these two sources is enough to replace around 55, let's say, percent of your salary. It's not as much as a lot of people want, but it's enough typically to have some kind of dignity in retirement. I'm happy to show you some numbers, but we looked at a couple different examples of simulations of people with say 30th percentile salary, 50th percentile, 70th percentile, and we found most people would have a balance in excess of $100,000. If once someone was, let's say, in the 60th percentile, I think their account balance at retirement would be in excess of $200,000. So it's a significant sum. It's, again, not enough by itself to allow people to have the ideal lifestyle in retirement, but together with Social Security, it can be enough to allow people to scrape by in a dignified manner.
Yeah, and again, I wanted to focus, I think just so few people have conversations about retirement or investing that I wanted to talk about that. And the other thing, we could spend a whole day conference on this if we wanted to, but I would tell people, if you've not invested in stock, people go, I don't know stocks, I don't know how to pick stocks. We as a society have made it really easy to do this, and that there are new investment tools. You may not know what this means, but an ETF, which is similar, but I would say better than a mutual fund. But there are mutual funds, there are ETFs. The long and short of it is, you don't have to go out and be reading stock prospectuses. I invest in the market, I don't read the prospectuses, but we've made it simple to have an automatic plan and to diversify. And one can just buy the S&P 500, which is in essence buying the whole market, and grow as the market grows. So I just say that as a side if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, I think it's very, 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 very important to say that I think it's a terrible public policy to say that in order to have a retirement, people should be able to pick their own stocks. To, on a detailed level, say, oh, I'm going to buy this many shares of this company, that many shares of that company. That's what we have traders and investors for. I certainly don't do that. I know I'm not qualified to do that. I don't think most of my friends and neighbors are either. So when we talk about investing for retirement, the goal of public policy should be to create simple tools that people with a minimal level of financial literacy can take advantage of and will be served well by. I think this bill is one example of creation of such a tool, but as you pointed out, there are plenty of other tools out there, and people don't need to feel like they need to know what time to buy stock in AT&T if they want to just save for their retirement.
Right. So again, that could be an entirely different conversation. I would just say, don't be put off by the fact that you don't know what stocks to buy. You don't have to.
Right.
There's simple ways to invest that you don't have to get involved in the stock picking game.
That's right.
Okay, so that's at 3%. Let's talk about some of the details and some of the criticisms that there were. So your plan would be 3% of the gross income. So if someone's making $100 a week,
Right.
First of all, would it have to be a full-time job or would it apply to a part-time job?
It would apply to a part-time job. Now, again, no one has to do it. So if you're just scraping by on 2 part-time jobs and simply cannot afford to put a few dollars away, there are people in that position. I understand and respect that. They're not obligated to, but they still have the tool at their disposal if they want to use it.
So you're working part-time at McDonald's, you make 100 hours a week gross.
So $3.
$3
Right.
a week would go toward this plan.
Correct.
Presuming you said, yes, I want to do it. You make $1,000 a week, it'd be $30.
That's right.
Could you do more than 3%?
Yep. You are subject only to the federal restrictions. So you can, if you want to get in there and make decisions, you can opt out, or you can do less than 3% or more than 3% up to the federal
So you could do
limits.
less than 3%?
Yeah, anything up to the federal limits.
Are those contributions tax deductible?
It's structured as a Roth IRA, so on the way in, they're not tax deductible, but all of the investment returns as well as the disbursements you draw down are tax-free.
That's good. And again, if you don't know what a Roth IRA is, that is better than a standard IRA, I would
It
say,
depends on
because
who
the
you are.
money grows. When you take it out, it's going to be $100,000, let's say, and that's when you want to have it be tax-free, and that's when it's a big pile of money is when you want it to be tax-free.
That's right. That's true for most people. There are some exceptions. It depends on your personal circumstances, maybe, but for most people, a Roth is better, and that's why we structured the bill that way.
That's good. Now, some of the business groups, maybe all the business groups, I don't know, but are
Not quite all.
not supporting. They're not supportive, and I'm a little bit surprised. They say it is too burdensome on the people that would run the small businesses. Now, again, I'm going to interject myself here and be biased. Maybe it would be, because I don't necessarily know all your structures. So let's talk about that. But when I ran a small printing business, I had like 5 or 6 employees, and you would set it at 25 employees.
Right.
I set up such a plan for my employees, and I didn't find it burdensome at all, because once I set it up with the stock brokerage home or whichever company that was, they did the administration. All I had to do was one day for maybe an hour and a half out of the year, sit down and set this up, and it was a one-time, and I just can't imagine that it's that burdensome.
Well, I'll tell you that
Or is it more so? I mean,
I think
are
it's
they
not.
misreading the burden?
I will tell you that I run a small business called Daniel Biss for State Senate, and most times we have either 0 or 1 employee. And here's what I do with my 1 employee. I use an online service, by the way, called Sure Payroll, a very successful online company founded by an Illinois entrepreneur. I pay them, I think, $32 a month, and they take care of everything. So I type in the employee's salary, and then they do an electronic transfer to pay salary. They do an electronic transfer to the U.S. Treasury Department to do federal tax withholding, an online transfer to do state tax withholding, unemployment insurance. This would be one additional function of that software, and it would be really very close to invisible to the employer. Now, when we filed the bill, that threshold was at 10 and not 25, because, as you said, even for a company with 5 or 6, it's not that big a deal. We went up to 25, which was
To accommodate the
it was a
objection.
painful concession, but there was a reason for it, and that reason is that there is research put out by the NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Business, which is certainly not quick to say that government mandates are easy to follow.
Yeah.
They did a study back in 2006 that said that for businesses with 20 or more employees, only 3% were not using some kind of service to do their payroll. So, and that was almost 10 years ago, and times have evolved, and many more businesses are taking advantage of these tools. So what we now know is that essentially every employer we're talking about would be using some electronic tool or payroll service that would make this really essentially invisible. I would add, by the way, that I don't know exactly what plan you put in place, but part of the purpose of this bill is to offload even some of that hour and a half setup time from the employer. You don't have to pick a plan, you don't have to pick a vendor. All of that is taken care of for you, and really the employer only has to do the payroll deduction. So there are some business groups that don't mind. For example, I think the single category of employers that would be most frequently affected by this bill is restaurants. Well, the Restaurant Association, they took a long look at this. They don't oppose the bill. But there are other business groups that I think take a instinctive response that says, well, any kind of obligation will be against regardless of what it really looks like in practice. And I've had really good discussions with a lot of those groups and tried to sit down and work through what exactly this means and what it doesn't mean and see if we can reach an accommodation.
I have a board member who is a union president, and they have pensions, which very few people do. But he and I have talked about retirement savings and this whole discussion. And he requires his members to put an additional $4 an hour into a 401k. So I just mentioned that
That's interesting.
you know, this is really, and one of the huge issues we face as a society is going to be the retirement of the baby boomers. So to the extent that we want to do what's right for not only individuals but for America, however we structure it, we need to do something better going forward. And I know I'm editorializing here, but we need to do something better going forward than what we've done in the past, because Social Security is not structured properly. We're going to have funding problems. We've got the state of Illinois pension with $100 billion in unfunded liabilities. What we've been doing in the past hasn't been working. There's systems that aren't structured properly.
Well, that's absolutely right. And I'll tell you, I came to this issue from kind of a funny angle. As you know, we've talked about this before. I've worked a lot on the public pension debt problems. And that feels like a different set of issues than this to a lot of people. But what I came to recognize in working on the public pension issue is that that problem was in large part caused by the fact that we were not willing to set aside the amount of money required to provide the benefit we said we wanted to provide.
Yeah, either the contribution was too low or the benefits too high, how you want to look at it. But
that's a judgment you can make,
but it
one way or
didn't
the
make
other.
mathematical sense.
That's right. One way or the other, whichever one should have been changed. We said here's what the benefit we want to provide is, and we just weren't willing to put enough the money to fund that. And frankly, in the private sector, the retirement savings crisis is just the same. If you ask people what kind of life do you want to live in retirement, they'll say one thing, and then if you ask them how much money are you setting aside, they'll say something very different. We as a society have not figured out how to set aside enough money to live the life we want to live in retirement. Now, in the context of public sector defined benefit pensions, that problem winds up looking like fiscal challenges for governments, whereas here the problem winds up looking like seniors living in poverty. But the root cause is really the same. It's that we have not said as a society, hey, if we're going to live this lifestyle in retirement, we got to do this while we're working to set aside enough money to pay for it. We have got to do work in all different aspects of our retirement policy to make sure we're putting aside enough money to live the lives that we want for ourselves and our families.
Now, here, aside from the objections that someone might say it's administratively burdensome, how do we know? So the money is not going to be in a self-directed IRA like at Charles Schwab or E-Trade or any of those things. It's going to be somewhere else. Where would the money be? Series of questions.
Okay.
Where would the money be held? What administration fee would there be? And how do we know the money is secure either from the likes of a Bernie Madoff kind of a guy who would rip it off, or how do we keep the politicians' hands off of it so they don't come in and swoop it up and say, well, we need it for something else?
Great questions all. So here's the real nitty-gritty of how it's structured. A board of 7 people would be created, chaired by the state treasurer, also on it as the state controller, the governor's budget director, and 4 other members. That board's primary responsibility would be to do a contract with some private mutual fund manager, essentially, let's say, choosing between Vanguard and Fidelity or something like this. And then that entity would manage the money. Now, the funds would go directly from the moment when the employer is still holding it before the paycheck gets written to the investment manager. The state would not touch the money. The money never passes through the state treasury. So the state actually never has access to it. It's held in a private trust that is legally owned by the participant, not the state. And the question then becomes, how do you guard against poor choices? And I think we have to be honest and say the state has not always been so great at making decisions. And that's why I think it's important that we're not setting up a new big in-house investment. We're not having the state pick stocks like we discussed before, or build a new function like exists in, for example, the pension funds. We're simply saying there are plenty of major kind of plain vanilla, successful IRA products currently on the market, and the state is simply going to choose between a couple of those to make sure the fees are as low as possible. And the question there is, how do you set up the board in such a way that that choice is transparent enough that people will feel some confidence?
Can that board, what would you do to structure that board so that it is not corrupted by politics in any way?
I think there are three tools. Number one is you give them a simple job, right? If you were to say, hey board, go and hire
It's kind of like once they set it up, what else do they do?
Exactly, exactly. If you're going to say, hey board, go and hire 500 people and have some of them do real estate investments in Japan, and some of them are going to do private equity and hedge funds, and some are going to be picking stocks, you're creating a place where malfeasance can be hidden. Here we're saying, hey board, choose between Vanguard and Fidelity. So number one, the simplicity of their responsibilities is key, and I think the most important part. Number two, the transparency. Once you have a simple choice they're making, it can be extremely transparent. There can be posting and notice requirements in advance, public bid process, so that a request for proposals is put out and the proposals are made public. This kind of transparency can be, I think, a very useful tool, particularly when what they're doing is simple enough that people really understand it. And then finally, the bill is written into the bill that the fees will be capped at 75 basis points.
Which is 0.75.
0.75%, which is well under the average for the industry, only achievable because there'll be a big pool that drives down the cost.
So for every $100 under management, the fees, right?
That's right. So for every $100 in there,
For every
you
$100,
put
it's 75 cents.
Exactly. And so that is a better than competitive rate when you compare it to what's out there, and it's a phenomenal, much better than competitive rate if you compare to what's out there for low-wage workers with small accounts. And so that also just says there's not a lot of money to plunder. The law is written in a way
and would
that,
these be individual accounts? So would Terry Martin have his own numbered account?
Absolutely.
And it's not going to be it's going to be under the control of, say, if it were Vanguard, which is a well-respected
exactly.
institution for investing.
But yes, it will be your account attached to your Social Security number, owned in a legal sense by you, and following you if you go from job to job.
Well, and that was the other point I was going to make. This isn't going to be where I got to keep working for the Acme tool company
That's exactly
so that
right.
I don't lose my retirement, which has been a problem in the past.
Absolutely.
But I could go from my part-time job to McDonald's to working at a part-time job as I go through college to then getting hired at a full-time position. And all along the way, I am contributing to that retirement plan, and it's in my name and my account number. Would I have to, every time I go to a job, would I have to continue to opt in, or I don't have to opt in, I have to opt out, but is it a one-time you opt in and that's the rest of your life, or every time you switch a job, is it a question of whether you have to opt in or out?
Well, first of all, you're not obligated to be in ever. You can opt out at any time. You could
Right.
you could fail to opt
I just didn't
out.
know if it was a trigger.
It's triggered when you're hired. So when you go to a new job, they put paperwork in front of you, the opt-out paperwork, and you can fill it out or not. And it's also once a year. So even if you're in, then every year there's like an open enrollment period where the employer.
Is it once? What if I switch jobs within the course of the year? I would, no problem, just saying yes, I still want to maintain.
Oh, that's right. If you take no action when you switch jobs, you'll stay in.
Okay, even if I switch jobs.
Correct.
Okay.
It's always opt-out. So you always have to take a step not to do it.
And again, then going back to the Vanguard is just one name. There's others, but if it were something like that, it would seem then the board that you're structuring, I'm going to use an analogy, it's almost as if we're starting a Monopoly game, and once the board establishes the rules for the game, they don't really have a role anymore, right? They
They don't
might,
do much. Yeah, that's right. I mean,
would they say you can only have, as a for instance, you cannot have more than 5% of your assets in any one investment, or how detailed would they make it, and to what extent then, as we progress and there are other investment opportunities that arise, would they review those?
So the bill, as currently configured, I think requires them to do a full review of the investment vendor every 4 years. And it doesn't require them to have a full 4-year contract, so they can structure it as they like for a shorter amount of time if they so desire. The bill does say that the default investment would be a target date fund, so if the financial world were to change enough that that were viewed as kind of too restrictive or the wrong
Are
thing.
you saying by target date that you want to have a balance of stocks and bonds, or?
Yeah, you want an asset allocation which is more focused on stocks, more aggressive when you're younger, and becomes more conservative as you near retirement, so that you have benefit from the growth of the stock market during the early years when you still have time to work and absorb the risk, and later on you have a more secure asset allocation.
What if I said, interest rates are at historic lows. I actually think that bonds right now pose an investment risk that I don't want to be a part of. Can I avoid bonds?
You can. The board is authorized to create other non-default investments. So if someone wants a more aggressive, equity-heavy portfolio, they can do that instead. I will say that this is set up as a bare bones package for people who probably, and for the most part, aren't making that kind of sophisticated decision, and I think most people who want to engage in that kind of active management of their portfolio might go elsewhere anyway.
You wouldn't be handcuffed, so to speak.
No,
You're going to have as an
absolutely
investor.
not.
So
Absolutely.
how often would one, maybe these are too detailed questions, but if I wanted to, would I talk then directly to, again, to use Vanguard as one example, would I talk directly to Vanguard and have a financial advisor as far as if I wanted to restructure my portfolio, or do I have to go through someone in the state of Illinois?
So that is left. So there's a variety of questions you could ask about what is on Vanguard and what's on the board. And some of those lines actually will be drawn by the board. So the idea is they'll contract out for as much of that as makes sense, but the bill doesn't require them to. So if they want some of the advising to be in-house, they can do that as well.
And then this doesn't apply to Indiana or Missouri. It's Illinois we're trying to fix. It wouldn't be, in my estimation, a bad idea for the country, but if I move from Illinois and am working in California, what happens to that retirement money?
It's a Roth IRA, so the money will sit there and keep on growing, or you can roll it over into something else. Now, I don't think you can contribute to it unless you're working in Illinois.
But maybe I could take it. Could I take that money out of there, and if I had another Roth IRA,
You could roll it into something that's based at your new place of employment in California. Now, I will say, I agree with you. This would make all the sense in the world on a national level, so that people who move from state to state to follow a job wouldn't be restricted. This was first proposed in 2006, and in the 2008 presidential campaign, both Senators McCain and Obama had it on their platform as a thing they supported as a national plan, and unfortunately, as you know, things tend to move slowly in Washington, so we're still waiting, and that's really why the states have stepped up.
I'll close it out, but what would you say to those who would say, hey, look at what happened in 2008 when we had the market fall by like 40%. How can you be proposing that people put money in the stock market?
We don't have any kind of retirement solution that doesn't rely on investing money. There is not one, except for Social Security. So if I were in Washington, I could engage in the discussion about should we expand Social Security so that we don't expect people to have any other assets besides that. But I'm not in Washington, and I can't have that discussion. Every other tool we have, whether it's IRAs that people have on their own, whether it's the 401ks and 403bs that they have at work, whether it's the defined benefit pensions in the public sector, all of those different assets are invested in financial markets, including in stock markets, and rely on that presumed growth to work. What this bill does is says that even though that system may be imperfect, that's the system we have, and right now 2.5 million people in Illinois don't have access to that system. At a minimum, we need to expand access to the current system, even if we also want to think about reforming it some other time.
Yeah, and I would make an analogy. We talked about real estate before, and you're right to what you were saying. In other words, when people have pensions, they may or may not know that, whether they're teachers or pipe fitters or whatever. Those monies that they're contributing to their pensions aren't put into a coffee can and buried in a backyard. They're
Oh,
invested
no.
in the stock market.
Absolutely.
So traditional pensions still have market risk. But to use the analogy of, a few years ago, few people could have bought a condo in Florida. But when that market collapsed, if you were interested in buying a condo in Florida, the market collapse was a good thing.
Right.
Because all of a sudden you could afford to buy what you couldn't have afforded to buy in the past.
Yeah, let me actually.
And if you're not retiring, if you're a younger person, the market goes down, I would say that's actually a good thing. Because again, you can buy Cadillac stocks at Chevy prices.
Yeah, let me expand on that because that's an important point about this bill. One of the real problems that happened with the crash is that people who were without good advice, managing their own accounts, they had all this stock, the value tanked, and then they sold it. Right? So they bought high and they sold low, and then they, in perpetuity, realized these losses. That's very, very, very dangerous. And the way you solve that is, well, one, you can just not save money, which is not a good option, or you can put together a plan that includes the expectation that the market will fluctuate, and you can stick with that plan in good times and bad, knowing you've designed something that is pretty robust. And again, the purpose of this system here is you design a very small set of very simple choices for people so as to hopefully guide people into behaviors that over the course of the long term will allow them to overcome any temporary market dips. People who sold their stocks at the bottom of the market are today suffering. People who held on to them are today actually in pretty good shape.
Well, that's right. The market hit its low in March of 2009 after the recent crash, and instead of selling there, had people been buying then,
Right.
you'd have made a very good rate of return over the last 5 years.
I believe it's more than doubled since then.
Yeah, easily. And as we close out, where does this stand legislatively? Do you have expectations? I mean, is it a tough road to hoe to get this to pass, or have you been talking to your colleagues and that they are supportive?
Well, the bill passed the Senate in April. It got out of a committee in the House on a really strong 7-2 bipartisan vote in late May. So it's waiting a vote of the full House, and I'm spending a lot of time traveling the state, talking with House members and answering questions like this. Frankly, having conversations a lot like this, only without cameras on, answering a lot of questions and explaining the purpose and maybe demystifying some of the bill and kind of working through concerns. The next scheduled session of the legislature is the veto session, which takes place for 2 weeks, one before Thanksgiving and one after Thanksgiving. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to build the support needed to have a successful vote in the House at that point. I'm not sure. It's going to be a lot of work, but I think we have a shot.
And what's the bill number?
It's Senate Bill 2758.
All right. Senator Dan Biss, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.